order to obtain a perfect microbladed eyebrow, you really need to perfect that frame. The frame are all of the strokes on the outside of the brow. It's what builds the structure. It's the red, orange, and yellow strokes. The stroke placement for the rest of your strokes heavily rely on correct placement of the frame strokes. Your first red is going to start on the baseline. Nice, even pressure. A 1 o'clock curve. You want that first red to start on the baseline. The baseline is the bottom line of that eyebrow, where the top line is the top line of that eyebrow. So your first red starts at the baseline and it doesn't come all the way up to the top line. As I go to do my second red, which I'm gonna start by staggering, so I'm gonna start right about here, I'm positioning my body, I'm turning my body a little so that I'm pulling my stroke towards me. As you know, you want these strokes to be moving up and over. If my strokes were just going up, then there would be a very choppy transition. Make sure that they're packed in tightly together. Make sure your body position is correct. You also want to make sure that you are doing your thumb roll. So I know for a lot of new microblading artists, they get what looks like a double line. When you go to curve your tool and you dip your hand and it creates what looks like a double line. What you want to do instead is you want to use your thumb, whether you pull or push your thumb, it will create this slow, steady curve. We have 4 red strokes so far. Now let's say that this is where our client's hair naturally transitions. So the goal of that is to get our last red to land at this transition or around that transition. So again, I'm just going to stagger these strokes, keeping them tight together. Now see here, I'm pretty much at my transition, so I'm ready to lay the last red stroke so that it lands on the brow mapping line. So I'm staggering this last red stroke so that it lands on the line, and see here how it creates like a staircase. I have my first red stroke that started at the baseline, then my second one, which was staggered off of that last red stroke, and that touched the top line. And then I'm gonna stagger again where that red stroke lands on that top line near that transition. Next, I'm gonna do my orange strokes. They hug that brow mapping line, that top line, and they always are going to be pointing towards the tail. Okay, so see how I turned my synthetic skin because I want to pull my strokes toward me. Okay, so that first orange stroke should start right on that top line. There should be a little space from the last red stroke and the first orange stroke. So see how there's a little bit of space right there? You don't want to do it like this, where there's a huge gap, because what's gonna happen is it's gonna look like there's a hole in your eyebrow. Now see how my last red and my first orange, it flows. It's not choppy. That's really important. Now the spacing for your orange strokes is really crucial. If they're too far apart, then there's going to again be a gap and you're not gonna have a eyebrow that looks filled in. It's still gonna look very sparse. I'm talking about the spacing of these orange strokes, okay? And do you see here how the end of the orange stroke is pointing towards the tail? It also, you see how these orange strokes are overlapping. Hug the line. And as I'm moving, notice how these orange strokes are still pointing towards the tail. All of my orange strokes are about the same size. You don't want some strokes that are really long and then some that are really short. Okay, right here in the tail. The tail for me, I always thought again was easier because you're pretty much just drawing a stroke on that brow mapping line. The end of the stroke is just coming off that brow mapping line just a teeny bit. And then the last orange stroke is always going to be on that brow mapping line. So that should be your easiest one. Now that you have your red and your oranges, you can actually draw your imaginary spine. So the spine is what separates the direction of hair growth. For this stroke template, which is the strokes are moving up, over, and down, your spine is going to be right underneath that first orange stroke, because now the stroke placement has moved directions. So I'm just gonna kind of draw this in. You also want that spine to land somewhere towards that lower arch. If it's way up here, then the eyebrow is going to look very droopy. Now let's do the yellow strokes. So the first yellow stroke, it really needs to hug those last red strokes. I feel like this is where a lot of newbies get a little messed up, because if that first yellow stroke is not hugging those reds right there, it will be very hard to get all of the rest of the yellow strokes to naturally start to fall and look like, dominoes falling to end on that lower arch. Now from here, the rest of the yellow strokes, you need to know two things. You need the spacing of the yellow strokes to be the same. You want the yellow strokes to point towards this spine right here. It's pretty light, but you can kind of see it. I feel like the yellow strokes are a little more difficult to master. Don't get frustrated if you're struggling with it. It just takes practice. Now right about here, I find that a lot of people, instead of extending that yellow stroke, they just, their strokes start to shrink in size. So we want all of those strokes to be the same size. If you don't extend those strokes, you won't be able to fill up that body. Equal spacing, extend your stroke, and that last one is going to lay flat on the brow mapping line. Right here, you are set up with a perfect frame, and it will be a lot easier to fill in your strokes. This is where we do all of our staircases. So we're gonna start with the tail and fill in all of our staircases coming this way. And then we'll fill in our body staircases. But until you feel like you have a perfect frame, I wouldn't move forward. Anytime you're struggling with something in microblading, always go back to the basics.